I spent $50,000 orchestrating the perfect humiliation. The ballroom, the press, the pitying glances, all arranged so Seraphina would finally understand her place in my story. But when those elevator doors parted and she emerged holding 2 infants with 2 more behind her, I felt the floor tilt beneath my Italian leather shoes. Julian Blackwood has built an empire on certainty. He chose Seraphina the way he chose properties, based on projections, bloodlines, and expected returns. When those returns failed to materialize, he restructured. The divorce wasn't personal, it was portfolio management. Tonight's baby shower represents the grand reopening of the Blackwood legacy, and every detail has been weaponized for maximum impact. He stands beneath a chandelier worth more than most homes, surveying a ballroom filled with politicians, business rivals, and society columnists. The guest list itself is a power play. He's engineered this night to broadcast a single message: Julian Blackwood always wins. The invitation he sent to Seraphina 3 weeks ago wasn't kindness, it was the final punctuation mark on their failed chapter. He pictures her entering alone, watching his triumph from the margins, and the image satisfies something dark in his chest. He justified this calculated cruelty as evolutionary logic. The strong replace the weak. The fertile inherit the earth. His new wife, Marissa, glows beside him in designer maternity wear, her pregnancy the physical proof of his vindication. He's already rehearsed his toast 17 times, each version sharpening the contrast between his radiant future and Seraphina's empty past. What Julian doesn't know, what his arrogance has blinded him to completely, is that Seraphina stopped being his victim the day she read the medical files he never bothered to examine. The ones that explained everything. 3 weeks earlier, Julian held the invitation between his fingers like a blade. Cream cardstock, gold embossing, Seraphina's name in elegant script. He'd upgraded the paper stock twice to ensure it felt expensive in her hands. Heavy. Undeniable. The baby shower invitation wasn't just an announcement. It was a closing argument. He imagined her opening it in whatever modest apartment she'd moved to after the settlement, the gold lettering catching the light as she read the details. Location, the Grand Meridian. Date, the anniversary of their divorce finalization. A coincidence he'd engineered with surgical precision. His assistant had questioned the decision. "Mr. Blackwood, are you certain you want to invite Miss Kingsley?" Julian had smiled. "Absolutely certain. She needs to see this. She needs to understand." What he meant was, she needs to see what I've built without her. The new wife. The coming child. The empire that thrived the moment he cut away the dead weight. He'd spent their entire marriage waiting for her to fulfill the one obligation that mattered, and she'd failed spectacularly. Now, he'd show her what success looked like on a functioning woman. He sealed the envelope himself, pressing down on the adhesive with his thumb. When Marissa asked why he looked so satisfied, he'd kissed her forehead and said, "Just taking care of unfinished business." The invitation arrived at Seraphina's address on a Tuesday morning. Julian checked his phone obsessively for 3 days, waiting for her response. When the RSVP card returned marked, "Yes, will attend," he felt something primal surge through his chest. She'd taken the bait. She was coming to witness her own irrelevance. He never considered that she might be coming for an entirely different reason. That her acceptance wasn't surrender, but preparation. That while he'd been composing his victory speech, she'd been building her own empire, one he couldn't see because he'd never bothered to look beyond his own reflection. Marissa stood in the center of the ballroom, one hand on her 6-month belly, the other directing the decorators with the confidence of a woman who'd never been told no. Julian watched from the mezzanine, admiring the theater they'd constructed together. Silver and white balloons formed elaborate arches. Ice sculptures spelled out, "Baby Blackwood," in crystalline letters that caught the chandelier light. But it was the branding that satisfied him most. Everywhere he looked, subtle reminders of lineage. The centerpieces featured miniature family trees with the Blackwood crest. The photo display showed 3 generations of Blackwood men, each holding an infant son. The visual narrative was clear: this was a dynasty continuing, not beginning. Should we really have his grandfather's portrait that prominent? Marissa had asked during planning. Julian had been firm. This child represents the continuation of something significant. People need to understand what they're witnessing. What he didn't say was that every design choice was a rebuttal to Seraphina. Each silver balloon was proof that the problem had never been him. The ice sculptures would melt by evening's end, but the message would remain frozen in everyone's memory: Julian Blackwood had moved on, moved up, and married correctly this time. The caterers arrived with 12 rolling carts of French champagne. The photographer tested angles near the gift table, which already groaned under wrapped boxes from senators, CEOs, and old money families who understood the importance of being seen at the right events. This wasn't just a baby shower. It was a social coronation. Marissa descended the stairs in a white gown that seemed to float around her. "Everything looks perfect, darling." She kissed him, and Julian felt the satisfaction of a man who'd corrected a mistake. This was what marriage should look like. This was what winning felt like. His phone buzzed. A text from his publicist: "Press are positioned. Ready when you are." Julian straightened his tie. In 2 hours, Seraphina would walk into this monument to his success. He couldn't wait to see her face when she realized she'd been replaced by someone better in every measurable way. 4 years earlier, Seraphina had sat in Dr. Chen's office holding a folder she wasn't supposed to see. The fertility specialist had left it on the desk during a phone call, and Seraphina's eyes had caught her own name on the tab. Then Julian's. Then a word she didn't immediately understand: azoospermia. She'd looked it up on her phone while Dr. Chen's voice murmured through the door. Complete absence of sperm. Irreversible. Genetic. The medical terminology stacked into an unavoidable conclusion: Julian couldn't father children. Had never been able to. Would never be able to. When Dr. Chen returned, Seraphina had asked the question with a steadiness that surprised her. "These results are his, aren't they? Not mine." The doctor's face had shifted through several expressions before settling on professional sympathy. "Mrs. Blackwood, I'm not at liberty to discuss. I'm healthy. Completely healthy. This whole time, it wasn't me." Seraphina had felt something crack open in her chest, but it wasn't relief. It was rage. 3 years of apologizing. 3 years of Julian's disappointed silences. 3 years of him positioning her as the defective one while his family whispered about her issues at holiday dinners. Dr. Chen had closed the folder gently. "These results came back 6 months ago. Your husband scheduled the appointment himself." The follow-up notes indicate he was informed of the diagnosis. 6 months. Julian had known for 6 months and never told her. Had let her continue taking fertility medications that made her sick. Had let her believe she was failing him. The cruelty wasn't in the lie, it was in the precision of it. "If he ever discusses this with me," Seraphina had said carefully, "I'll act surprised. But I need copies of everything. Every test. Every result. Every note from every appointment." Dr. Chen had hesitated, then nodded. Some truths demanded documentation. Seraphina walked out of that office with a folder that changed everything. She didn't confront Julian. She didn't file for divorce. Not yet. Instead, she started planning. She documented every conversation where he blamed her. She recorded every family dinner where his mother suggested specialists. She built a case not for court, but for the future. When Julian finally filed for divorce 8 months later, citing her inability to provide an heir, Seraphina had signed without argument. She took the modest settlement he offered, sold the jewelry he'd given her, and disappeared from his social circles so completely that people assumed she'd been broken by the separation. But broken women don't spend 18 months researching sperm donors. They don't carefully select traits that mirror their own. They don't plan, with methodical precision, to have exactly 4 children using a fertility clinic 3 states away. Seraphina hadn't been broken. She'd been building. The first guests arrived at 6:15, precisely 15 minutes before the invitation time because arriving on time was something only the unimportant did. Julian recognized the mayor's wife, 2 appellate judges, and Marcus Chen, his primary business rival, who'd probably come just to calculate the cost of the event. Within 20 minutes, the ballroom hummed with the particular frequency of wealth and power. Women in gowns that cost more than cars. Men whose handshakes moved markets. The press penned into their designated corner, cameras ready. This was the guest list of someone who mattered, and Julian felt the validation in his bones. But it was the whispers he'd orchestrated that satisfied him most. He'd made certain the right people knew about the invitation he'd sent. As guests arrived, the story spread like champagne poured into a crystal pyramid. Did you hear he invited the ex-wife? A woman in emerald silk murmured to her companion near the gift table. Brave of her to actually come. I heard she couldn't have children. That's why he left. Well, clearly he didn't have that problem. Look at Marissa. Glowing. Julian drifted through these conversations like a shark through warm water. Each whisper confirmed the narrative he'd constructed. Seraphina was the failure. He was the success. His new marriage proved who'd been defective all along. Sometimes, he thought, there was a satisfaction in watching a story you'd carefully shaped take root in other people's minds. The way a well-told narrative could become truth simply through repetition. Maybe some listeners felt this too, those moments when a story pulled them somewhere unexpected, when they stayed with something even when it hurt. If you've ever felt that pull, you know why you're still here with me now. Marcus Chen approached with 2 glasses of champagne. Generous of you to invite Seraphina. Not many men would be that magnanimous. His tone suggested he knew exactly how not magnanimous the gesture actually was. I believe in closure, Julian said smoothly. She deserves to see that life goes on. That some people are built for legacy, and others. He let the sentence drift, incomplete and damning. And she RSVP'd yes. She did. Julian sipped his champagne. Should be arriving within the hour. Marcus studied him with the assessment of someone who'd negotiated against Julian too many times to trust his surface explanations. You're playing a dangerous game, Blackwood. Public humiliation has a way of backfiring. Only if you're the one who ends up humiliated, Julian replied. He excused himself as Marissa signaled from across the room. The photographer wanted couples shots before the crowds thickened. Julian positioned himself in front of the family tree display, Marissa's hand in his, and smiled for a camera that would capture this moment forever. Or so he thought. The blue Escalade pulled into the circular drive at exactly 7:32, 8 minutes before Julian's scheduled toast. Seraphina watched the valets scramble to open her door, their faces carefully neutral as they registered the specialized strollers being unloaded from the rear. She'd chosen blue deliberately. Not the soft pastels of baby showers, but sapphire, the color of deep water and expensive jewelry. The kind of blue that commanded attention. Her gown was custom, fitted precisely to her post-pregnancy body with an elegance that suggested power rather than apology. The nanny she'd hired for the evening adjusted the strollers while Seraphina lifted two of her children from their car seats. 4 months old. Perfect timing. Old enough to be undeniably real, young enough to be carried. She'd orchestrated this entrance the way a general plans a decisive battle. "Are you ready, Miss Kingsley?" the nanny asked softly. The woman had been briefed thoroughly. "Stay behind Seraphina. Let the visual impact speak first. Exit quickly once the point has been made." "I've been ready for 4 years," Seraphina replied. She adjusted her grip on her son and daughter, identical faces, the same dark eyes she'd chosen from the donor catalog specifically because they matched her own. Behind her, the 2 remaining infants rested in their strollers, visible through the clear canopies. She could hear music drifting from the ballroom. Vivaldi. Julian always chose Vivaldi for important events because he'd read somewhere that it suggested sophistication. She knew his patterns. Knew his vanities. Knew that right now, he was probably standing near the stage, mentally rehearsing the speech that would position her as the tragic footnote to his success story. A valet held the entrance door. Seraphina paused, letting herself feel the weight of what she was about to do. This wasn't revenge. Revenge was emotional, messy, temporary. This was correction. She was about to take the narrative Julian had written about her and reveal it as fiction. She thought of every dinner where his family had pitted her. Every doctor's appointment where he'd sighed with theatrical disappointment. Every conversation where he'd suggested, with cruel gentleness, that perhaps she wasn't meant for motherhood. He'd built an entire identity on her supposed failure. Seraphina stepped through the doors and headed toward the elevator that would take her to the mezzanine ballroom. In her arms, her children made soft sounds. Real sounds. Undeniable sounds. In 8 minutes, Julian would begin his toast. She planned to arrive during the opening remarks, when every eye was already trained on the stage. Maximum impact. Minimum escape. The elevator ascended. Seraphina watched the floor numbers illuminate, counting down to the moment Julian Blackwood's carefully constructed world would collapse. She'd stayed quiet for years, protecting him even after he'd destroyed her reputation. That protection ended tonight. Julian was 4 sentences into his toast when the ballroom doors opened. He'd just reached the part about the continuation of legacy when the music stopped. Not paused. Stopped. The string quartet's instruments went silent mid-phrase as if sound itself had been cut. 500 heads turned in unison toward the mezzanine entrance. Julian followed their gaze and felt his prepared speech dissolve on his tongue. Seraphina stood in the doorway, backlit by the corridor's recessed lighting, holding 2 infants. Behind her, 2 specialized strollers came into view, each containing another child. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. The ballroom existed in a pocket of suspended reality where Julian's brain struggled to process what his eyes were reporting. Seraphina wasn't alone. Seraphina wasn't empty. Seraphina was walking toward him with 4 children, and the visual contradiction was so complete that he felt dizzy. She descended the stairs with the controlled grace of someone who'd rehearsed this moment. Her sapphire gown caught the chandelier light. The infants, identically dressed in white, were clearly, undeniably real. Guests parted automatically, creating a pathway that led directly to the stage where Julian stood frozen. Marissa's hand found his elbow. "Julian, what is this?" Her voice carried the edge of someone who sensed social disaster approaching but couldn't yet define its shape. Seraphina reached the base of the stage. She looked up at Julian, and he saw something in her expression that terrified him: complete calm. This wasn't grief or jealousy or defeat. This was calculation. She'd planned this entrance down to the second. "Please, continue," Seraphina said quietly, her voice somehow carrying through the silent room. "You were saying something about legacy?" Julian's mouth opened. Closed. The microphone in his hand had become a foreign object. Behind Seraphina, photographers scrambled to reposition, their cameras swiveling from the stage to the woman with 4 infants. This was the shot they'd remember. Not his toast. Not Marissa's belly. This. Marcus Chen's voice drifted from somewhere in the crowd. "Well. This is unexpected." Unexpected didn't begin to cover it. Julian had built this entire night on a foundation of Seraphina's supposed inadequacy, and she just walked in with quadruple proof that the foundation was rotten. The whispers started like fire catching dry paper. He could hear fragments. "Are those hers? Where did those come from? How old are they?" Julian tried to recover. "Seraphina. What a surprise. I didn't realize you'd be bringing guests." His voice sounded hollow even to himself. He was scrambling, and everyone could see it. Seraphina smiled. "It wasn't warm. You invited me to a baby shower, Julian. I thought I'd bring mine." She adjusted the infant in her right arm, and the movement drew every eye in the room to the 4 identical faces. "Or did you assume I didn't have any?" The implication hung in the air like smoke. Julian felt Marissa's grip on his elbow tighten. The entire night had just pivoted on an axis he hadn't seen coming. His carefully constructed narrative was unraveling, and he was standing on stage with a microphone, watching it happen in real time. Julian's survival instincts kicked in with the desperation of a drowning man. He forced a laugh that sounded almost natural. "Well, this is certainly dramatic. Though I have to say, Seraphina, the timing is suspicious. For infants appearing out of nowhere right as I celebrate my own coming child." A few nervous laughs rippled through the crowd. Julian pressed his advantage. "I mean, we were married for 5 years. 5 years of specialists, treatments, disappointments. And now, what, 6 months after our divorce, you suddenly have quadruplets." He made his voice light, conspiratorial, inviting the room to share his skepticism. Convenient. He was implying rental. Borrowed props. A desperate woman staging a scene. Some guests nodded, wanting to believe the simpler narrative. But Seraphina didn't flinch. She reached into the small bag hanging from her shoulder and withdrew a folder. "Birth certificates," she said clearly, holding them up. "All 4. Born 3 months ago at Mercy Presbyterian. All mine. Genetically verified." She opened the folder and pulled out official documents, holding them high enough for the front rows to see the state seals. The nervous laughter died. Marcus Chen, bless his opportunistic heart, called out from his position near the bar, "May I see those?" Seraphina walked the documents over to him. The room watched as he examined them, his expression shifting from curiosity to something harder to define. "They appear legitimate," Marcus announced. "For birth certificates. Mother listed as Seraphina Kingsley. Born September 15th. Genetically verified through the hospital's standard testing protocols." He looked at Julian with something that might have been pity or might have been satisfaction. "Congratulations, Seraphina. Quadruplets. That's remarkable." Julian felt the room's energy shift. The narrative he tried to force, desperate woman with rented props, collapsed under the weight of official documentation. But he still had one card to play. "Genetically verified," he repeated, seizing on the phrase. "Verified as yours, certainly. But whose else?" He let the question hang. Because we both know that during our marriage, with all those specialists, it wasn't going to be mine. He'd meant it as a reminder of her failure. Instead, it became the detonation point for everything that followed. Seraphina's smile widened, and Julian realized, too late, that he'd just walked directly into her trap. "You're absolutely right, Julian." Her voice was steady, surgical. "During our marriage, it wasn't going to be yours." She paused, letting the room absorb the phrasing. "Would you like to tell everyone why? Or should I?" The ballroom went silent in a way that transcended mere quiet. This was the silence of collective held breath, of 500 people sensing that something irreversible was about to happen. Julian's hand tightened on the microphone. Marissa's face had gone pale. "Maybe you felt this, that moment when you're watching something unfold and you know the characters will never be the same. When you want to look away but can't because the truth, however ugly, matters more than comfort. If you're still here, listening to this unfold, it's because you understand that some truths need witnesses." Seraphina looked directly at Marissa. "Ask him," she said quietly. "Ask your husband about the test results from Dr. Chen. The ones from 4 years ago." Julian's publicist tried to intervene, suggesting they move the conversation somewhere private, but Seraphina shook her head. "No. We're doing this here. Julian chose a public venue for my humiliation. He gets a public venue for his reckoning." She turned to the crowd, and Julian realized with horror that she was about to address them like a courtroom. 4 years ago, Julian and I were seeing a fertility specialist. After 2 years of trying, we both underwent comprehensive testing. I was told I was perfectly healthy. Textbook fertility. She paused. Julian was diagnosed with azoospermia. Complete absence of sperm. Genetic condition. Irreversible. The words landed like physical blows. Julian heard Marissa's sharp intake of breath beside him. Around the ballroom, phones emerged from pockets and purses. This was no longer a social event. It was news. "That's a lie," Julian said, but his voice lacked conviction. He could see people calculating timelines, doing the math, arriving at conclusions that made his stomach drop. Dr. Philip Chen at the Reproductive Medicine Center of Manhattan, Seraphina continued. September 2020. "I have the medical records. I've had them for 4 years. She pulled another folder from her bag, thicker than the first. Complete documentation. Test results. Genetic analysis. Follow-up appointments. Including the ones where Dr. Chen explained that this condition meant you would never biologically father children. Marcus Chen, no relation to the doctor, but clearly enjoying the chaos, spoke up again. If this is true, Blackwood, why the hell didn't you tell her?" Julian's mind raced for explanations, deflections, anything that would stop this freight train of exposure. "The doctor said there were treatments." "The doctor said there were no treatments," Seraphina corrected. "0. Your condition isn't treatable. Which means you knew, for 4 years, you knew, that if we didn't have children, it was because of you. Not me. But you let me take the blame. You let your family treat me like a failure. You built your entire divorce narrative around my supposed inadequacy." She turned to Marissa, and her voice softened with something that might have been genuine sympathy. "I'm sorry you're learning this way. But you deserve to know what you're married to. Not just medically. Morally." Julian watched his wife's face cycle through emotions too quickly to track. Confusion. Disbelief. Horror. Then calculation. He could see her doing the math everyone else was doing. 6 months pregnant. Husband biologically sterile. The implications were arithmetic. Julian. Marissa's voice was small. Is this true? You can't have children. He wanted to lie. Wanted to deny everything. But Seraphina was holding medical records that could be verified. The doctor's name was public. The truth was documented. His silence became its own confession. Marissa, let me explain, he started, but she'd already stepped away from him, her hand unconsciously moving to her belly. Protective. Defensive. The gesture of a woman who just realized she was standing next to a man who'd built their entire relationship on fraud. The ballroom had gone from silent to buzzing. Hundreds of conversations erupting simultaneously as people processed the implications. Julian heard fragments, if he can't have kids. Then whose baby? She must have. The scandal was multiplying in real time, spreading beyond anything he could contain. It was the mayor's wife who said it loudly enough for the microphone to catch. If Julian can't father children, then whose child is Marissa carrying? The question detonated across the ballroom like a flashbang. Marissa's face drained of color so quickly Julian thought she might faint. She gripped the edge of the stage, her knuckles white, and looked at him with an expression he'd never seen before, pure, undiluted terror. Julian, I can explain, she started, and the room collectively gasped. Because that statement, that desperate opening, was a confession in itself. If the baby were his, there'd be nothing to explain. Julian felt something crack inside his chest. The betrayal wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was that he'd invited 500 people, including press, to celebrate proof of his own cuckolding. He'd spent $50,000 to broadcast his humiliation. Whose is it? His voice came out strangled. The microphone amplified every syllable to the corners of the ballroom. Marissa looked around desperately, seeking escape routes that didn't exist. It's complicated. Answer the question. Julian had prosecuted enough depositions to know how to pin someone in a corner. If I'm sterile, and you're pregnant, whose child are you carrying? The silence was excruciating. Then, from the side of the room, a man in a charcoal suit, someone Julian recognized as Marissa's personal trainer, moved toward the exit with the subtlety of someone who just realized he was about to become collateral damage. The movement caught a dozen pairs of eyes. Then 2 dozen. Then everyone. Connor. Julian's voice rose. Connor Reeves. My wife's personal trainer. He laughed, but it was a sound without humor. You're carrying your personal trainer's baby. Marissa's tears started, but they fell on the rocky soil of a crowd that had no sympathy left. This was too perfect. Too tabloid. The cameras that were supposed to document Julian's triumph were now capturing a double exposure of infidelity and fraud. Julian turned to find Connor, but the man was already gone, the ballroom door swinging shut behind him. Smart. Julian would have done the same if he were sleeping with someone else's wife and getting her pregnant while said wife was married to a man who invited press to document his victory. Did you know? Julian turned on Marissa. When you married me, did you know I was sterile? No. I swear. But you knew you were sleeping with him. Julian gestured toward the door Connor had fled through. You knew this wasn't my child. You were going to let me raise another man's baby as a Blackwood. The enormity of it crashed over him in waves. Everything he'd built tonight, the dynasty narrative, the legacy messaging, the proof of his virility, was a lie. Worse, it was a lie everyone now knew. The press was typing furiously on their phones. This would be online within minutes. Seraphina, still standing at the base of the stage with her 4 children, looked at him with something that might have been pity. I'm sorry, Julian. I didn't know about Marissa. I came here to expose your treatment of me, not to destroy your marriage. She glanced at Marissa. Though it seems your marriage destroyed itself. Julian barely heard her. He was watching his life collapse in real time, each piece falling with increasing velocity. His reputation. His marriage. His legitimacy. The respect he'd spent decades building. All of it crumbling because he'd been so certain of his own narrative that he'd never questioned its foundation. Marissa fled the stage, one hand clutching her belly, the other covering her mouth. Several women followed her, not to comfort, Julian suspected, but to witness. This was the story people would tell for years. The baby shower where everything imploded. He stood alone at the microphone, beneath the baby Blackwood ice sculpture, surrounded by 3 generations of Blackwood family portraits, and realized he was the end of the line. Not its continuation. Seraphina collected her children with the efficiency of someone who'd accomplished her mission. The nanny reappeared, helping secure the infants back into their strollers. Around them, guests were already leaving, phones pressed to ears, eager to be the first to spread the story to those who hadn't witnessed it firsthand. Before she reached the door, Seraphina paused. She turned back to look at Julian, still frozen on stage beneath the chandelier, and felt something unexpected, not triumph, but exhaustion. This man had shaped 4 years of her life, and now she was walking away from him for the last time. For what it's worth, she called across the thinning crowd, I hope you learned something from this. Not about fertility or honesty, but about how you treat people when you think no one's watching. The truth always surfaces, Julian. Always. She didn't wait for his response. She guided her children toward the elevator, leaving behind the wreckage of Julian's carefully constructed empire. Julian remained on stage as the ballroom emptied. The caterers were already beginning cleanup, gathering abandoned champagne flutes and wadded napkins. The baby Blackwood ice sculpture had begun to melt, water pooling beneath it like tears. The family tree centerpieces sat on tables surrounded by empty chairs, a visual representation of legacy interrupted. Marcus Chen was one of the last to leave. He paused near the stage, looking up at Julian with something between pity and satisfaction. You know, Blackwood, I've always wondered what it would take to humble you. I just never imagined you'd orchestrate it yourself. When the ballroom was finally empty, Julian walked to the mezzanine windows overlooking the city. Light stretched to the horizon, a million lives being lived by people who, by tomorrow, would know his name for all the wrong reasons. He'd wanted to be remembered. He'd wanted to dominate the narrative. He'd gotten his wish, just not the way he'd planned. His phone buzzed incessantly. Text messages from board members, business partners, family. He ignored them all. What could he say? That he'd lied about his fertility? That his wife was carrying another man's child? That he'd invited the woman he'd publicly shamed to witness his triumph, only to have her expose him instead? The truth was simpler and more devastating. He'd spent years constructing an identity based on someone else's supposed failure, and it had taken exactly one night for that identity to crumble. Seraphina hadn't destroyed him. She'd simply revealed what was already there, a foundation built on lies. Below, Julian saw a blue Escalade pull away from the venue. Through the tinted windows, he couldn't see Seraphina, but he imagined her settling her children for the drive home. 4 children. Living proof that she'd built a life without him. That she'd thrived. The Welcome to Baby Blackwood banner still hung across the far wall, mocking him with its unfulfilled promise. There would be no baby Blackwood. No dynasty. No legacy. Just Julian, alone in an empty ballroom, finally forced to confront the man he'd become when he'd chosen cruelty over truth. He thought about calling Marissa. demanding explanations. But what would be the point? The damage was complete. The marriage was finished. Everything he built tonight had been designed to prove his superiority, and instead, it had revealed his emptiness. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, through the cruelty and the exposure and the collapse, maybe you understand what I've learned, that the stories we tell ourselves are dangerous when they require someone else to play the villain. That vindication isn't the same as victory. And that sometimes, the person you're really competing against is your own reflection. Julian walked out of the ballroom just after midnight. The chandeliers dimmed behind him, leaving the space in darkness. Outside, the city continued without him, indifferent to his fall. Somewhere in that same city, Seraphina was putting her children to bed, building the life she'd always deserved. And Julian was alone, finally understanding that he'd lost everything the moment he'd decided another person's failure was required for his success. The ballroom door closed behind him with a soft, final click. I hope you enjoyed watching this as much as I enjoyed creating it. Like, share, and comment on the lessons you've learned. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. See you in my next story.